So, unlike other talks I give where they tend to be multicolored with lots of pictures, the slides here are going to be more on the pedestrian black and white side, and they're simply there to a large extent to help me make sure I say what I want to say, and I guess because I think a little bit of visual offsets the audio when you hear somebody speak, I at least always appreciate it. I call this Measured Reflections because I think it's a way of expressing how I feel about faith and science, how I understand it internally, which is part of what I understood the thrust of the discussion today to be. They're measured in the sense they're considered, but they're measured in the sense that I value quantification as a Christian. I think as a scientist, it is a value that scientists cherish and that I particularly do personally. It's part of what makes me a scientist internally, I suppose. So I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about myself. I was born in Montreal, but I did not grow up there. My father got a job transfer when I was 2 years old, so we moved to what is now called Mississauga. It wasn't called that back then. And then we moved to St. Catharines for a short period, or just beside it. And then when I was 9, we moved to Hamilton, and I spent the rest of the time growing up there until I got married and moved away from the postdoc. So I stayed in that city. I went to McMaster for a BSc, and then I got a master's and doctorate at Toronto. I did postdoctoral work at Harvard University for 2 years. And then I was fortunate enough to get a job as an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, and I was there for 3 years, but I didn't trust them to make that permanent, and University of Waterloo advertised a job in a completely different area, and I said, I don't do that stuff, I do this stuff. But they interviewed me anyway and hired me, and I'm still there. So that's a rather capsulized, I guess, primarily professional history. So, in terms of the reflection part, I thought I would just talk about faith, and some of this is semi-biographical, autobiographical. I was raised in a Christian home, by which I mean my parents went to church. It would have been, as you can see if you're reading ahead, it wasn't an evangelical church upbringing. In fact, it's sort of a mongrel church upbringing. So in Montreal, I was baptized at the age of 6 weeks in the United Church of Canada. And then when we moved to what is now called Mississauga, it's Clarkson, we went to a Presbyterian church. My father's family had that background. I was too young to remember. There was some problem in that church, so we went over to St. Bride's Anglican Church, since my mother had an Anglican background. And basically, until I got married, I was part of that church. I was raised in it and confirmed in it. And confirmed by deliberate choice, not because, I was, of course, they try to encourage everybody. I didn't do it because I felt guilty, because I felt I had to, because I just chose to do it. There was a group, I don't know if any of you have heard of it, called Young Life. It was quite active in the 60s and 70s, and other friends I knew went to it. And partly due to the influence of that group, I did what in evangelical terms would be called the acceptance of Christ as Lord and Savior. But I always qualify, I say deliberate acceptance. I never viewed this as something like I didn't really know what I was doing. It wasn't a rejection of anything I had earlier. In some sense, it was more of a fulfillment of what I had done. I never saw a good reason not to believe in God. I didn't see a good reason not to, by and large, accept the Christian narrative as I was raised. It was a point where I think I deliberately, internally, and maybe vertically, chose to to accept the faith I was raised in and to accept Christ in the personal terms that I think are at its best very well described within evangelical communities. So I was actually, because some of the people at Young Life were involved in a different United Church up the road called Binkley United Church, I began to go there more, and they asked me and another friend to start running a church youth group, which had a few kids, and we kept going, and it built up to its height about between 3 and 4 dozen. And at the time, I mean, during that period, I got married to my wife, Nancy, and we celebrated our 40th anniversary in May of last year. Got married in May 6th of 1978. And we have one daughter, Heather, who actually lives in Squamish now. But so Nancy and I, Nancy didn't start with me in the youth group. That was another Christian friend who's now a physician in London, Ontario. But she joined in, and we did this until I moved away we moved away, so I postdoced at Harvard. And then while at Harvard, we attended a church called Grace Chapel, which was in Lexington, Massachusetts. And Nancy and I both believed that you should fully participate in the Christian community that you choose to go to, and we thought we should join, and it was a criteria that you become baptized as an adult to join, so here we go again, I did it. But again, it wasn't a contradiction, it wasn't like all that other stuff was wrong. We did it primarily because that particular branch of the body requested it, and we did it. When we moved back to Toronto, we joined Spring Garden Baptist Church, and then 3 years later, friends of ours that we'd known for a very long time were attending a Mennonite church in Kitchener, and while their attendance wasn't the only reason we went, it was the original reason for going. Hey, they're going there, we know these guys, let's go. And so, for the most part, since then, we have been involved in the Mennonite community, but as you can tell, I don't have that background. And my wife was a counselor. She has more degrees than I do. I like to say, she wouldn't say it this way, but she's had about 7 different jobs in her life. I've had 1. But the largest fraction before 2003 was being a career counselor at the University of Waterloo, but she felt the call to ministry, and so entered theological training around 2003, and she just seems to be able to get jobs without any difficulty. So during the first year of training, someone at a seniors home in New Hamburg called Diffview, I think it's called Diffview Mennonite Homes, they said, we need a chaplain, and would you be willing to come and do it? She said, well, I'm not fully trained yet. They said, well, you do this part-time while you're doing it, and you'll have a part-time job here, and we're okay with that, and so she did. So she did complete theological training 5 years later, and then in 2009, she did get a pastoral position at Waterloo Kitchener. That's the WK part. It's called Waterloo Kitchener United Mennonite Church. Then we went on sabbatical to Australia 2014-15, and when we returned, she took up an associate pastor position at a rural church, Floridale Church, which is near the small town of Elmira, which is outside of Waterloo. It takes about half an hour to drive there from her house. And then she retired last July. She felt she had done what she could do. And so, but during this, of course, on sabbaticals, I went on sabbatical in Cambridge, in Santa Barbara, in Brisbane. And we always have attended a place of worship that we've been to for a long period. And I don't know if did you just talk about this kind of addiction in the CSCA? Maybe I'm a church addict, but whenever I go to church. Like, it is rare I do not attend some body of worship on a Sunday somewhere. The only exception would be as if I'm 30,000 feet in the air I just find a church. I do everything I can to find a church in the place I'm in and go there. And I do it partly because I think going to church is a bit like exercise in a spiritual sense, partly because I like to see how other segments of the body of Christ operate. How do Christians think in different parts of the world? What are their issues? What are their concerns? What do we have in common? So as you can see from the bottom, we've been, I've been everything, man, I've been everything. Like that old Hank Snow song, I guess. So that's basically my faith background, and I feel it's this part of me, I guess, since I was very young. It's a mixture of upbringing with deliberation. And I don't want to diminish either of those factors relative to each other. So, what about the other part? Science. Well, usually people that go into this subject are pretty good at it. I was good at arithmetic. I was good at a number of things in school, except phys ed. I was really bad at that. And art, I wasn't very good at. But the rest, I was all pretty good at it. But I was quite good at math, and it wasn't a matter of being good at it. It was very satisfactory. The most satisfactory thing about mathematics and science secondarily is it is totally independent of the teacher's opinion. Unlike English, unlike history, there's this thing the kids feel, well, the teacher doesn't like me. Math, doesn't matter if they hate you, if they love you, the answer is in the back of the book. and I say that it's a bit funny, but my impression is many people of scientific inclination and persuasion value that very highly, and those that don't just don't get it. And there is this divide, I think. I mean, I'd love to see it studied psychologically, but my hunch is it's correct. And as a comment about church life, many people that go into the ministry and many within church, they don't get that part. Even if it's their kid, oh yeah, Johnny likes math, I don't get it, but it makes them happy, and it's pushed aside as an area of interest. But what is being missed there is the affinity people have for quantitative thinking and how they find it so intrinsically satisfying. So, as a child, I didn't find any big issues. I remember once a friend says, why do you believe in God? You can't measure it, you can't see it. Didn't persuade me. I guess, I don't know if it was because of the way my parents, probably more primarily my mother, articulated it to me, or what, but it was clear God was not something that can be fully contained and analyzed scientifically, that there was this transcendent dimension to God that I guess I always saw as complementary. To me, I don't know why everybody doesn't think like this. This should be normative. What I find, and I still get surprised about, is it seems to be very much the exception instead of the rule. That in both sides of the coin, in more liberal upbringings, people reject the faith part. It's, its function is kind of fairy tale-ish, right? Like Aesop's fables, that's okay, but nothing much more. In the evangelical churches I reach, many brought up that say they were terrified to ask questions. I don't get it on either side. I mean, to me, it was certainly way more than a fairy tale. I mean, it had real import in many dimensions. One of them had to be historical, or I thought, if this stuff didn't happen to Jesus, what's the point of the rest of it? But I wasn't afraid to ask questions. I just did it. Maybe I had foot and mouth disease, I don't know. But I actually, math, I said I probably liked it the best. I think physics in high school, it was okay. I probably actually liked chemistry better. But I went into physics because, naively, I thought job prospects were better. In fact, they're worse, actually, statistically. If you want a really good job, you should go into math, because insurance companies will hire you, and actuarial and accountancy and all that stuff, but I had no idea. I was totally naive. My parents were not university educated. My mother had grade 8, my father had high school. So I had no background or reference line for how to do this. But what I discovered, and perhaps this was God leading, what I liked about math was solving and calculating and analyzing. Proofs didn't excite me a whole lot. And that's what you do in theoretical physics. You actually are solving equations and you're interested in the answer. And the closest mathematical comparator, I would say, is applied mathematics, where you're more interested in whether or not the equations can be solved. Under what conditions could they be solved? Once they find them, that's the end of the problem. Physics, that's the start of the problem. Okay, what's the answer and what does it mean? And so what I found as I went on is that there is this, I think, very deep connection between what you learn in physics and more generally in science and what I guess I might call ultimate truth or reality. And so, in part, doing what I do professionally is how I work out my own salvation. I really do think it is an exploration of actuality. I mean, this was supplemented by reading. I read almost everything C.S. Lewis ever wrote. When Polkinghorne came along and wrote his stuff in the 90s and onward, I read all of that. And I would say when I read Polkinghorne stuff, I thought, this is what I've exactly thought my whole life, is what he's saying. So now I'm a bit annoyed. I wish I'd written that down. There you go. But it was the way I had always understood the situation, I guess. So why do I keep doing science? Well, I thought it's easy to complain either about your church or about your profession. I suppose we're a bit hardwired to gripe. But what is it that's positive? What do I find fulfilling? And you can read it on here. I like training students. I have 13 grad students right now, which even I think is a bit sort of nuts. Plus 5 visitors, plus 2 postdoctoral visits. I got a group of about 20 people. And it is a lot to keep track of. Why do I do it? Because I have a terrible time saying no when they want to work with me. But really, I like doing it. I like working with doctoral students, masters, and undergrads wanting to do research, because I like learning about how to go from a place where you learn science to the ability to actually discover science. It's a bit like, it's much more fun to sing in a choir than it is to listen to one. Now, of course, sometimes I like listening, but I personally, it's more fun to sing in it. Maybe if you're not good at singing, then you don't like it. But so it's a bit like that. I actually do like teaching classes. While it is, the part I don't like is marking. That's the part I really don't like. But fortunately, where I come from, we have grad students that help with most of that. It's a bit annoying. I mean, the thing about teaching is you can't, class is Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 10:30 in the morning. Say you better be there Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 10:30. Now, of all the problems in the world, that ranks pretty small amongst those who have to go into a mine and dig dirt or so. But I mean, on the other hand, in the academic life, you're used to being autonomous. So this is the biggest infringement on one's autonomy. And when I have asked people that retired, there's no mandatory retirement, but there's a couple. I met a guy who retired early that I'd known for a while, and another one recently last night, and it was the teaching. They wanted to no longer have that constraint. But for me, I like it. I like figuring out how to better explain things, I should say things, to people, not just one thing. And it's partly why, to the extent I volunteer in church, probably my number one job choice still would be some form of Sunday school teaching for the same reason. Because I like doing it, and because I think there is great value in what churches have to teach. And if anything, I think church, not all churches, I think adult education and children's education within church should be valued. I don't know anywhere else in society well, except maybe seminaries, where the Bible is taught, where people can be engaged with the issues of the faith. And now in this highly secularized culture, this is very radically diminishing. And apart from belief, it's a cultural impoverishment. Western civilization is integrally connected with the Bible. That's Northwood Fry. It's not me. Again, maybe it was me, but I didn't make it. And then also there is the science for its own sake. There is fulfillment in discovering new things. And I think this is something all scientists have in common, whether it's some organism in biology or some new geological structure or some psychological study or some theoretical physics equation. There is that satisfaction that we have learned something we did not know in the past. And not just we personally. I mean, nobody knew it in the past. So I view theoretical physics maybe a bit differently from what a lot of people have tended to articulate in public. And I wonder if even there's a shift going on in the discipline now. But I view this as an exploratory endeavor as to how the world might be. So you have an idea, you explore what it does, you see where it goes. Ultimately, not just any old thing for a crazy reason. You want it to be coupled to some situation in the natural world, but because the natural world is not fully understood, you have to change something in science to see what will happen. And in theoretical work, there are established theories. They work mostly very well, but not perfectly, not fully satisfactory. So you've got to change something to see what happens. And theoretical physics is the discipline of changing a something to see how the description possibly could be improved. And of course, it's way better if there's some empirical check you could put on the theory, but often that's removed. And then in the long run, as I said a little bit before, I find it fulfilling in the sense that I think science points beyond itself, the intelligibility of the universe. It points to an intelligence. And I think this endeavor does teach us about God. Now, for non-scientists, I find, like of Christians, they find it hard to get this. It's a bit like, how do you get to know God? When this is discussed in Bible study groups and churches, almost all the time they mean the emotional part, the personal part, the feelings part. Oh, that's okay, right? I mean, I guess we have, I'm a scientist. I can have feelings if I have to. But what this part tells us, if you think about it like knowing a person, what does it mean when we know a person? Well, we often mean the emotional part, the relational part, but there's another part. How tall are they? What's their hair color? What color are their eyes? What do they weigh? What are their medical that's sort of the external part. And I view science tells us about that kind of external part about God. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, why not? It's a way of appreciating the majesty of God, but they're sort of the external features. Now, of course, if all you know about a person is the external features, I would agree, you really don't know the person. But on the other hand, if you said you knew a person, what's their hair color? I don't know. How tall are they? Beats me. What do they like to wear? I mean, would you also really, quote, know the person? I would contend, well, there's room for improvement. So this is, I think I'll stop here. I don't know how better to express the faith science part. I do think there are challenges at both ends. I'm not a person who thinks whatever science finds out is theological easy riding and makes God look good. There are some serious challenges that have come in science. Conversely, there are challenges faith presents to science, certainly in terms of application in biomedical ethics, in terms of peace and justice issues. I have said this to scientific groups. I think it's, well, there was a point, I don't know what they are now, a quarter of the world's scientists worked in the defense industry. I mean, do we really need that many? Is that really the best use of God's scientific gifts to people? So those are kinds of questions that I think need to be asked. They need to be asked. They push in both directions. Anyway, I will stop here if there are questions.
Well, thank you, Rob.
My question is, in your experience, what are the top N reasons where N is greater than 2 that people view faith in the science as incompatible?
Yeah, that's one of the top N reasons where N is greater than 2. Well, on the science side, I think people have been dazzled by the extraordinary success of science. I mean, science gave us this, science gave us that, electricity, all kinds of great benefits. And I think they are dazzled by that, but sometimes inappropriately, because the costs and failures in places have often been underestimated or put aside. So I would say that's one reason. Another is I'd say a rigidity in certain sectors of religious faith in general, Christian faith in particular, or sometimes people say it's fundamentalism. I'd rather not use that word. I'd say it's a bit of a rigidity in thinking that is, for those of scientific persuasions, they just vote with their feet when they're younger. I think that's probably those people in scientific disciplines that used to go to church don't. I'm pretty sure if you asked all of them, oh, church, real nice people, you know, Mrs. Smith would make these nice lasagnas at the potlucks, but they're not speaking my language. They don't hate them. It's just that there's no relevance. And so that would be connected with reason number 3. I think churches there is huge room for improvement in churches in nurturing scientific curiosity. And it's weak on both sides, as I said before. In conservative churches, my impression is they're afraid of the questions that might be asked. It's too threatening to a theological worldview. In liberals churches, the other way around. Doesn't matter what the answer is. Whatever's right for you is whatever's right for you. And so they just don't, it's not that they hate science. It's just that, oh, I don't know, but what difference does it make? And that's equally unsatisfactory to a scientist. The scientific mindset is about falsification to an extent. Discovering that if a system could have been this way or could have been that way, you could do an experiment and discover which was the case. So I think the main reasons why that inability to nurture curiosity happens is because there are selection effects. The people that go into ministry, whatever type of Christian ministry there is, they tend to not be interested in science. There are exceptions, but that's the whole point. They are exceptional. And I've talked to some, like the well-meaning ones are just afraid they don't have the expertise and to meaningfully discuss it. But I think it's a matter of how do you nurture it in your young people. Look how many people go into science. In any church, somewhere between 30 and 50% of people younger than 18 are going to end up in some scientifically connected profession. What is the church saying to them at all about how they nurture that part of their lives? The best churches, even in the best churches, they're interested in dealing with their personal life, their concerns, but the science part, well, it's just not relevant to them. I mean, we're really missing an opportunity here. And I think many, like I'm a stubborn person who stayed, I guess maybe for the reasons I said, but most, they learn, I really like science. My church, nice people, but I want to go here and they're not interested, and they leave. I think that's the dominant, I bet that's a huge reason why people leave. I would conjecture that statistically that's probably the biggest reason, by which I mean the greatest number of people leave for that kind of reason. Just a lack of interest from their faith community, not a hostility. That's my opinion. So those are three reasons. I could go on, but I think other people should speak. Yeah.
I read in an article not too long ago that the author wrote this. They said, a theology of divine action should not violate special relativity. And I guess I'm wondering if you think that it's legitimate at all to limit God's action based on what's learned from physics and other sciences.
Well, the short answer is no, but it's a qualified no. So one theological consideration that has come up is that why would God make laws of nature and then violate them, so to speak? And I think it's a good question. So there is a strain of Christian theology that says we discover the laws of nature and God respects God's own laws. But I don't think it's quite that simple, because it begs the question of how rigid the laws of nature are. And this is where I'm, again, Polkinghorne said it, I thought it, but he did it before. The laws of nature seem to be subtle. It's a bit like a mesh. There's a kind of rigidity to a mesh or a net, but there's also a flexibility. And both properties are needed, and I think that's the kind of reality we live in. The best manifestation of that is that human beings, I think, have free will. In fact, I'm going to go out on a limb. I think higher order mammals, animals, even birds, might have some measure of free will, by which I mean they make choices that are not algorithmically determined. And humans, it's the most complex by a significant margin, but anybody that's had a dog or a cat would say the dog and cat make choices, and I don't think that's just anthropomorphic projection. So the laws of nature are supple, and I think God, when God acts, it's within that measure of flexibility, so you can't say there's a law being broken or not broken. Now, could you have a hard break? Well, I'm a little more of the persuasion, God's rules, God's laws. So I think the answer is yes, this could happen, but to the extent the Bible teaches us about this, miracle-wise, there's generally a very, very, very good reason. It's not like God says, time for another show, folks. Here we have, I'm going to saw this lady in half or something, right? No, it's not like that. So when Jesus walks on water, there's a reason for it that underlies it. And so miracles of that latter type are exceptionally rare. I'm not willing, if you're a hardline scientist, you say, well, they're so rare they never happen. That's David Hume's argument. But as Lewis has said, well, if they never happened, then they've never happened because they've never happened. But it's just a circular reasoning, right? It doesn't prove it, it's an assertion. And I think as a scientist, I need to be open-minded enough that maybe the universe is an open system. And in some sense, as a person of faith, I think, a Christian faith, I think you have to believe that the universe has some measure of openness to God's actions. Now I feel I'm getting long-winded. So maybe somebody else has a comment.
There's a recent book that's come out, I think it's called Lost in Math, and it's this, that the contention that physics has lost its way recently, or maybe just particle physics or a small theoretical component of physics lost its way because it's just pursuing things for mathematical beauty, and it's not empirically, it's lost its mooring from its empirical base. Do you know the book I'm talking about?
Well, I'm not familiar. I'm not familiar with the particular book, but there have been a couple of other like it, like Smolin's The Trouble with Physics, and there's another book, Peter Voigt, Not Even Wrong. So, but I think I understand the general thrust of the argument is that in theoretical physics, particularly as manifest in string theory, there's an enormous amount of effort spent by a lot of people working on a theory for which has not had any significant empirical confirmation, and based on the latest data, it's slowly beginning to be disfavored, by which I mean the Large Hadron Collider has not seen any evidence of supersymmetry, and they should have by now. By which I mean they've placed upper bounds on superpartners, but they should have actually seen the superpartners particles, the top orbital gluon. So in the sense that it's lost its way, partly, I would say to the extent I said this, it tells us how the world could be as well as how the world is. What we've learned is all the could be stuff hasn't worked. I think that's a soundbite summary of my career lifetime. Supersymmetry seems not to have worked. Technicolor doesn't work. Magnetic monopoles, not there. There's a list that go axions, still can't find them. So now, should these ideas have been explored? Yeah, I think they should have. The question is, how much effort should be placed into it, given what we know now? What we have learned is that the model of particle physics that emerged beginning in the 40s and was sort of near finalized by the mid-70s, it does have weird, quirky features, unsatisfying inadequacies. And so from the mid to late 70s, when I started in this until now, there have been all kinds of ideas tried about how to improve or extend this. And when I say what we've learned doesn't work, it's that we have learned that does not work. We have not figured out how to put quantum physics together with gravity. After the largest scientific army in history has attacked the problem, the greatest number of people with the greatest level of education, we still haven't cracked that problem. So that's another example of something that has not worked. Is there anything beyond the standard model? There's lots of ideas of what could be. In fact, I'm still working on something called asymptotic safety. But so far, it's just the standard model. 6 quarks, 6 leptons, photons, 1 photon, 8 gluons, 2 W's and a Z, and the Higgs, and that's it. What do we make? I think this is an interesting time in scientific history. We've discovered all the stuff we expected to, and we have not discovered a single thing that lies beyond. Anyway, something else. That's what I would say. Have we lost our way? Yeah.
So I have a question that I hope isn't going to be too offside, and I'm just going to feel my way through this question. So I'm interested in your comment that about 25% of scientists at one time working in the defense industry. So I'm not a scientist, I'm a historian. And war is one of the things I study, and one of the things that we look at is the narratives that are just so ingrained in Western society about war, and we pull those out when we need to. So how can we, as educators, allow for those who are quantitatively driven, right? Those who have quantitative minds and want to go in that direction. And obviously defense spending you get funding This is one of the things. You're not
Right.
consistently having to go to the well for money. So
Especially in the United States.
yeah, and a lot of scientists will say, those who are involved in defense research, they'll say it's curiosity-based research, and that's why I'm doing it. I'm doing it for the science. I have, how it ends up being used, well, that's somebody else's problem. So how do we bring together the qualitative analysis with the quantitative?
Now, that's a very, very good question. Those are the kinds of questions that need to be asked more and more. In the 80s, I belonged to an organization called Science for Peace, and it was primarily concerned with nuclear weapon proliferation. And I joined it because I thought, look, non-Christians are doing this, I can't be silent on this. To what extent did they do any good? I guess maybe some in terms of those educational purposes. Nancy and I have supported Project Plowshares for many years. That's where I got the statistic, and that I read it about 15 to 20 years ago. So I don't know what it is now, but I have no reason to believe it's significantly changed. So how do we do it? Well, it's a broad question. The number one thing I would say is I think there needs to be very active listening within churches to each other. And it's not easy to listen to people that don't think the way you do. It's sad. Let's just sit there and listen, right? Well, yeah, it really isn't easy to do. And so that's why it needs to be actively done for the non-quantitative people to listen to the quantitative and vice versa. There should be some understanding of reciprocity. But I've met it as an adult. They're well-meaning people, but if it goes to some, you can tell their interest level drops instantly, and they want you to change the subject. So I think we need to figure out ways of opening up these dialogues and proactively encouraging people to listen to one another. I think this, as a side comment, applies across the political divide. I think we see there is more polarization in the electorate, not only in the States, but in Canada than any time in my lifetime. And I think the echo chamber is a real phenomenon that people don't. I first encountered it when I was in Australia in 2014-15, and we met an Australian couple, 5 years older than me, Gordon and Elizabeth Melvin, and he had a job in Denver, Colorado for 15 years. And so I said, what was it like? And he said, well, the funniest thing was the Democrats and Republicans never talk to each other. They just they don't socialize. And I said, come on. And he said, yeah, it was, that was the first I heard of it. They both said, yeah, this was real. And what I see confirmed in newspapers and voting patterns is, yeah, they just don't listen to each other. And I think more than ever, ordinary people need to talk to each other and listen to someone who really doesn't agree with you on an issue. It's not just theological, although it is partly. I had another when I was in Santa Barbara about 8 years ago. It was still sort of, I'm tempted to say the tail end, though it wasn't obvious at the time, the tail end of this God delusion stuff, the militant atheists. But the minister said, it's interesting, atheism has turned into anti-theism. And there's a big difference, right? It's one thing not to believe in God, but anti-theism means if you believe you're a dangerous person potentially, and you need to be cordoned off and put under control. So it's curious, right? The most highly educated population in the history, in the history of civilization is not finding consensus based on knowledge. We're dividing based on knowledge. Anti-vaxxers, climate change, gun control. In fact, there's a study, I said I wouldn't go on, one more, and then I'll try and get back. There's a study by a guy named Dan Kahan, I think this is his last name, from Yale, and he basically finds that the more scientifically educated a person is, the greater the division of opinion over an issue like gun control or climate change. In other words, he thought that if you have a Democrat and a Republican and you ask, is climate change an important issue, scale of 1 to 10, they'll both answer a 5. Democrat, a little bit higher than Republican. The more scientifically educated, it splits like that. So a highly scientifically educated Democrat says, yeah, climate change is a real problem. Highly scientifically educated Republican, no, it's not a big deal. How about that? So I think churches could play an important ministerial role in getting people to listen to each other. And I think, dare I say it, frame it in a theological and a biblical context that reminds us all of our higher call. And I think some of it will happen serendipitously, but I think some of it needs to happen actively. Sunday school classes, sermon series, maybe public fora where we invite other people. Like instead of yet another debate about Christians, about creation evolution, what about a debate about climate change for Christians or refugees, but bring into it a quantitative perspective in a number of these things. And it'll be work. It won't be easy. I mean, it'll be challenging and difficult, but that would be what I would say. And with kids, to start there, to try and figure out it matters more, I think, when kids enter their teens, to listen to those guys that the dorks that like science and calculations and computers. How do you speak to them? How do you minister to that curiosity? Not just to them, not regarded as a peripheral atom, but rather as something that's relevant. Those would be the things I would say. Yeah?
Picking up on that, do you have examples from say you'd like to be involved in Sunday school and so on, of examples of bringing science into your own church bodies successfully?
Well, I've done it sometimes on request. Again, it's trying to coerce somebody into learning science is like pushing a donkey from behind. They've got to be willing to listen, and even if they find out they don't like it, then you can say, look, you wanted to hear this. Now, there's something to be said for making the pedagogy accessible, and I mean, as I say, that's part of my interest there. But that being said, I think I'd like to see a lot more churches be a lot more proactive in creating these opportunities, not just to learn about science as science, but to understand how scientific thinking could influence a discussion on refugees. There is a role to play certainly on climate change, on biomedical issues. And again, it's a caricature, but I don't think too much of a caricature. In a liberal church, if they want a scientific perspective, they'll just pick a scientist. They don't care if they're a Christian. I've seen this happen, drives me crazy. I say, look, they don't have the faith perspective, guys. So it's like they don't speak the language. Now, that doesn't mean I don't think we should listen to any, but I'd say at the very least, can't we invite some scientists that are Christians as well? That's the problem on the liberal end. But on the conservative end, it tends to be a reluctance to grapple with difficult questions, to more get someone in that you are very confident will repeat the party line theologically. Now, I don't think that's totally valueless. But on the other hand, it's not adequate. We need someone who's willing to say, okay, if this is the party line, we have these tough issues to address. There are some that do it, like Catherine Hayhoe is the rock star of doing this in climate change. She would be an example of how you've got to push people in directions where it's not that I don't agree with the party line, guys, I do, but how we've got to go beyond that. We've got to build on that foundation to address this problem. So those are the things I think. Now, I don't expect a pastor to have scientific expertise or a pastoral staff necessarily. Nice, but I understand why, right? I mean, if they really like science, they'd probably do what I do, right? But I do think it's reasonable to expect that churches can conscientiously and deliberately seek out the necessary people and nurture these things. I do think that's what their job should be. And that's you know, I mean, I once had a guy said, Rob, we don't have any expertise. Okay, find the people that do. Encourage the people to do. They're not that difficult to find. Does that help? That's what I'm saying.
It's quarter after 1. If there's really a burning question yet, go ahead and ask it. I see any other hands being raised, but so thank you very much, Rob, for your
Thank you all for your attention.